let's talk about what we have going on here. First of all, what we've done is we've set up a logic session,
Yeah.
and I have two copies of the same file, which is pink noise at, I believe, minus 6 dB.
Yeah, with -6, right.
And so what we've done is we've copied those two files, so we have the same signal going into both channels. And then
Mm-hmm.
on each channel, this is the first one and this is the second one, I've
Mm-hmm.
inserted an EQ. So we have a channel strip and a channel EQ. And we
Mm-hmm.
have them hard panned left and right and being sent out to the
To the
equivalent of
main.
DAW1, DAW2 to the
Yeah.
Mio. So
Right.
that's what's coming in here. So if I stop if I stop Logic, we'll see that it stops coming in on DAW1, DAW2.
Yeah.
And if I start it back up, it comes back in on DAW1, DAW2. So
Mm-hmm.
what we've done then is we've taken DAW1 and DAW2 and we've sent it back out on FireWire 1 and 2. So that means it's coming back to the computer.
Mm-hmm.
And we've actually made two copies of the DAW1, DAW2 channel. So we have one that's just going back to the FireWire 1, 2. And then we have another one which we have muted that's going through a graph.
Yeah.
And it's going back to FireWire 3, 4. Now, why are we doing this? Well, because in addition to Logic running, I have SpectraFu running. And in SpectraFu, what we have set up is, I'm going to move Stefan down here.
Mm-hmm.
We have this meter is set up to look at FireWire 1 and FireWire 3. So this is the equalized signal coming from channel strip. And
Yeah.
this is the difference between the channel strip and the channel EQ from Logic. Now,
Yeah. Okay.
right now,
Peter,
right now
you
I-
should. Hold on. One thing
sorry.
you should show the thing what we have on FireWire 3 coming in, because you insert there a graph with those some
Right.
different thing.
Right,
Where we
so-
can show this.
right now I have the graph bypassed. So let me
Okay.
show you what the graph is. The graph has DAW1 and DAW2 coming in, and we go into a sum difference block, which is going to make the channel 1 plus channel 2 and channel 1 minus channel 2. And we're taking the minus and we're sending it back out to FireWire 3, 4. So if I unbypass this, what will happen is that we'll see that those two signals now sum to nothing. They're 100% completely nulled. There's no signal coming in at all. In fact, if we go and we pull up this, we could actually pull up the bit scope.
Oh yeah.
So we can pull up the code meter. And so if you look at this, right, this is the code meter running for the signal that is coming in on FireWire 1, which is the output of the channel strip EQ. And if I switch this to FireWire 3, we'll see that there's absolutely no activity. There are no bits changing at all. So we have a complete
Wow.
100% null.
Okay.
Okay. Now, the other thing that we have going on, let's see, what else do we have on this display? We have the metric halo transfer function, the SpectraFu transfer function, and again, what we're looking at on the transfer function is the source we're using as the channel strip EQ'd signal, and the response we're using is the channel EQ signal from Logic. And right now, the two plugins are bypassed, and what we see is that we have an
Nothing.
absolutely flat frequency and phase response, right? And then the last thing that we have over here is the first channel. Again, this is set to be FireWire 1, and this one's FireWire 3. So this is showing us the signal that is coming out of the channel strip EQ, and then the other one, because the signal level 0, we're not seeing any activity, and that's going to be the difference between the two signals. Okay. So, now, if we go back to Logic, make this window a little smaller, right? And we go and we take the channel EQ and we unbypass it. Let's see what we got. So, we've unbypassed the channel EQ, and what we're seeing is that the transfer function is showing us the frequency response of the channel EQ. We have it way zoomed in, so let me zoom it back out. And if you look at it right now, so this is the frequency response of the channel EQ. Yeah. And if you see, this is the setting that we have set on the channel EQ, right? So they pretty much match. And this is the phase response of the channel EQ. And then what this is up here is showing us is the frequency response of the un-EQ'd signal and the frequency response of the difference between the two. Right? And so let's think about this a little bit, right? What's happening is that at the center here, where we have the frequency, the level pulled down at 500 hertz, we have the level pulled down like 20 dB. Yeah. The difference between the two signals, the signal coming out of the channel EQ is 20 dB below the signal coming out of the channel strip, and therefore there's basically no difference being made out of 500. And then as we get closer and closer to not making any change in the signal, the signal nulls more. And, it basically fully nulls up here at the Nyquist frequency. Yeah, okay. Okay? So now, let's see what happens if we go and we turn on the channel strip EQ. Yeah. So we'll turn on the channel strip EQ. And, hey, look, we go look at the transfer function and, it nulls. Yeah. Now, we spent a lot of time getting those settings exactly the same, as close as we could. Yeah. But does it null really? Yeah, this is interesting. This is the interesting part. Yeah. So let's go and first we'll take this and we'll zoom it in. Yeah. And now that we zoom it in, well, it doesn't exactly null. I mean, it's still a little hard to see, but if you read up here where the relative power is read out and we move the cursor in this range, it's a few hundredths of a dB off. And now remember, no one would claim about normally. Right, and if we look at the null signal says, hey, this is nulling to like minus 63 dB, minus 62 dB, which is a pretty good null. But if we look at the bit scope, we see that we actually have bit activity up to like, the 12th bit, the 11th bit. Yeah. Right? I mean, even if you were talking about a 16-bit recording, that means that the difference between the two signals is, 4 or 5 bits of signal in a 16-bit recording, and in a 24-bit recording, it's even more. Yeah. Now, the very interesting thing is if we go back and we look at the spectrum. Yeah, this is interesting. The top trace here is the spectrum of the output of channel strip. And then the bottom trace is the difference between the channel strip spectrum and the channel EQ spectrum. And what we see is that while it's certainly quite a bit below the level of the actual signal that we're differencing from, it's still quite a bit higher than the overall noise floor of the recording would be. Yeah, definitely. So if the thing is that basically if the differences are masked by, loud signals in certain frequency bands, then you're not going to hear that. But if they're not masked, well, that you might hear. And the thing is that the way you'll hear that is in the context of warmth or brightness or, these sort of very difficult to pin down terms where you don't know exactly what they mean, but you know them when you hear them. Yeah. Now, let's go look at what we have the EQ set to just to sort of understand this. This is the channel EQ. We have it set to 500 hertz, minus 20 dB, and a Q of 2. And this is the channel strip EQ. And we have it set to minus 20, 500 hertz, and a bandwidth of 0.97. Now, by the way I understand the computation of Q and bandwidth, in my mind, the right setting for this should be 1. But when we used 1, we didn't get nearly as good a null. So if we go and we change this...
Yeah, change it back, then you can see how it is.
Oh, we lost Stefan. If we go and change this to 1, what will happen is that we'll find that the difference is actually now not trivial at all. It's like 0.2 dB in the skirts. Even though it matches up at the actual specified frequency and off at the far ranges, we have a fairly large shift. And that shift is going to cause us to hear things that are different. Now, yeah, we could sit here and tweak the EQs and get them to null, and that's in fact what I did. So if I do 0.98, it'll null a little bit better. And if I do 0.97, it'll null a little bit better still. But the thing is that, it took us 5-10 minutes to figure out precisely what these right settings were. And with other EQs, you have the same issue. It becomes difficult to figure out precisely where you are in the system and make things match. Now, and honestly, if you have to spend a lot of time figuring out how to make them match to get the sound that you want, then that's going to kill your creativity and your flow. So, there's a certain degree of ergonomic workflow associated with this as well. If the controls are set up in such a way that you can quickly dial in the sound that you want, you're better off than if you have to spend a lot of time fiddling with the controls to get it to behave the way that you think it should. At the end of the day, you can make 2 sort of standard IIR digital EQs sound very close to each other, but I'm not sure that's exactly the point. It may very well be that the trick to this is to understand that just because you can make them match doesn't mean that effectively they're the same. There are other aspects of these things that are important. And again, once we start to throw in things like emulation of distortion characteristics and saturation, all bets are off.
Right. We stopped. Yeah, we nearly were at the end of the demo, I think. Huh? And
yes.
And yeah, we should have a kind of summarize, because I think it was pretty clear what that means, huh? At the end.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, what that means is that while you can take 2 sort of standard implementations of digital EQs and get them to match with some degree of precision, because of things like lookup tables or precision of calculations, it's going to be very difficult to get them to match exactly.
Yeah.
Really exactly, like nulls to 0.
Yeah.
And the thing is that not nulling to 0, it still potentially sounds different, even if they null very closely.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, there's also the aspect that, there's a certain degree of workflow. If it's easy for you to dial in the sound on one EQ, and you have to spend a lot of time thinking about how to make things happen on another EQ, then you're better off with the EQ that you can dial the sound in on.
Yeah, right. Absolutely.
And then my final thought on that is that as soon as you start taking into account things like saturation models and distortion models and trying to sort of bring in a little bit more of the analog character of these things, all bets are off, because then the details of the modeling that was approached is not part of the standard digital EQ experience, and they're all going to sound different.
Okay. My God, awesome! That was really eye-opener in my opinion, because I read so many discussion about this null test where people said, yeah, that equal out to minus 70 dB, so I don't care about it. I remember this thing, and I would like to add this also to our Tech Talk as a download. There was a very, very interesting lecture from Michael Garson. He's mathematics. He died in the beginning of 90s. And he did a very, very interesting lecture about the research that starts with the BBC in 1950 and goes on. And I remember that Philips also did something like that in the 80s and even in the 90s and to right now, researching how much effects got very, very low signal on our perception.
Yes.
And it is much more than you think. And there is also some interesting researches going on right now. And I remember there was those company doing this clocking, Grimm did some research with a university in the Netherlands, and they also did good research on the nerve system, the human nerve system, and see the effects of how different people react to different signals, to digital, to analog signal, and even to filters, the different type of filters. And it came also to interesting results. I would check back with those guys from Grimm, what they end up, and maybe we can invite them also to some talks about that aspect. However,
that would be fun.
Yeah, it would be great. Yeah? And but it's interesting. I like to recommend, take care. Take care with your signal.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the thing is that basically, at Metric Halo, we're very empirical about things, right? I mean, I don't like the whole concept of, everything matters, because it's not true. Everything matters, but in degrees of hierarchy, right? I mean, if you have, if your speakers have 1 or 2% distortion, then you probably don't have to worry about problems that are down in the hundredths or thousandths of a dB. They're just going to be fully masked by other issues. So there's things that are of relative importance. There are things that are more important and things that are less important. And we like to have sort of an understanding of like I said, it's not that these things are impossible to measure. It's just that they're hard to measure, right? Hard to measure is meaningful. Impossible to measure, well, maybe it's meaningful, but it's really hard to act on, right? And so the thing is that, when we tend to stop worrying about things is when we can't come up with any way of identifying something that goes beyond our perception of the moment. And the problem with the perception of the moment is that human beings are incredibly good at convincing themselves of things.
Yeah.
Even things they don't want to believe in, right? So the thing is that, if you can't come up with a way of isolating your biases, then you're not going to make too much progress. And so we try to not chase after things where we can't isolate the biases, or where there's absolutely no explanation that we can come up with in the physical reality that we currently inhabit for why something should be. Because the thing is that even if it's true, it's like not anything that you can really act on. But this question of like, well, why would EQs sound different? It's easy to demonstrate. It's hard to measure the deltas, in sort of a live situation, but you can clearly set up a lab situation where you can demonstrate them very easily.
Yeah.
And as soon as that's possible, then you know that you got something to work with.
Yeah. Definitely. And another interesting aspect is, I saw this on my own as I started developing this Q factor, and suddenly I realized how my perception on frequencies and sounds, what it means on a sound, what a frequency got a relation to a composition or a production, that increased so much. And when you start understanding things, you suddenly hear it. I remember in the beginning when people talking about the differences of converters said, "Hey, is there a difference of converters?" And then I said, okay, is there a difference of converters? And start to learn to listen to the things and suddenly understand it. And then I could hear it. And then I found, oh, wow, yeah, this has an effect on my production. Of course, it got. And
one of the things that we've, because the first thing that we ever did was SpectraFu, right?
Yeah.
This is something that people have told us time and time again, and we've certainly personally experienced. The thing about, there's like two schools of thought with, the FFT analyzer. There's the school of thought that says, I use my ears. I don't need an FFT analyzer. And that's probably true. But what our experience has been is that using SpectraFu, maybe not every FFT analyzer, but SpectraFu in particular, in the context of careful listening while making decisions and using an additional sense, makes you hear better.
Yeah,
it improves your hearing. It makes you aware of things, and it allows you to consciously identify in a concrete way things that you were only sort of emotionally feeling before.
Yeah, that's true.
And as you work with it, your ability to consciously understand what you hear improves. Maybe to the point where you don't need it anymore. But, it's a tool that lots of people, you can develop skills that you didn't necessarily have simply by working with it. And it comes back to, for example, that difference signal that I showed you, which is that, it's really easy to look at a meter and say, well, it's minus 60, it can't possibly matter. And then you look at the spectrum and you realize, oh my goodness,
Yeah.
there's all these different ways that it could possibly matter.
Yeah, definitely. It's really, I must say, with that thing that you show me, with the some different things, it's the first time, this is something like the click in your head, where you said, okay, this is something I take a closer look the next time I do anything with audio, because this is definitely much more energy in all of a signal that definitely makes sense.